Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020, and this Green Socialist live stream is about continuing the eco-socialist politics that Angela Walker and I ran on. So I'm going to say a few words about what's going on, and then we'll have questions and answers. First, I'll start off with three pieces of good news this week. New York City, the city council voted to give voting rights to immigrants for local elections. And that's important because, they pay taxes, their kids go to the schools. I mean, in a democracy, people should be able to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. And actually, that was not a problem in this country for immigrants to get involved in elections until the 20th century. So this is really going back to a better policy. A second piece of good news is that Stephen Donziger, who's the environmental lawyer that Chevron has captured the courts and prosecuted, he won a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron for polluting the Ecuadorian Amazon. And they have gone after him ever since. Got that ruling. It was, made in Ecuador. U.S. courts have told Chevron they don't have to pay. And then they went after Donziger and accused him of fraud and other things in the case. And then he was prosecuted because the Southern District of New York would not prosecute him. The judge had a private prosecutor go after him who's linked to Chevron. It's a terrible case. If you haven't read about it, look it up. But anyway, he was convicted of contempt of court because he wouldn't give him his electronic devices, which he still needs. There's attorney-client privilege information on there as he appeals his cases. And so they convicted him of being in contempt of court, 6 months in prison. But he got released this week because of a law in New York that gives prisoners the opportunity to get out because of COVID, and where he was staying, COVID was spreading. So he's back at home arrest, now going on 3 years, but he's in a better position to fight for his case. So that happened Thursday, I believe, and so that's good news. And then Shama Sawant looks like she has survived an assault by a big business in Seattle, the real estate interests, the landlord developers, to recall her from her position on city council. And both sides spent nearly $1 million, and in a race where I think it was about 20,000 votes on each side, she's leading, now that they've counted all the paper ballots, by about 250 votes. So it looks like she survived, and that's good news. They're still dealing with, I think, around 500 ballots that may be able to be cured. But the demographics of those ballots are in her favor. So it looks like she survived. And it's just encouraging that this massive assault by the business class, it doesn't want to be taxed. She leads this Tax Amazon campaign, fought for the $15 minimum wage and the other things that they don't like. They pulled out all their guns to get her, and they missed. So this is the fourth time she's been able to beat the business interests. And so that's something for us to celebrate. But there was bad news this week. I believe it was yesterday. Yeah, yesterday, the British High Court ruled that Julian Assange can be extradited to the U.S. Now, Assange can still make a couple of appeals, but this was really a ruling on a lower court decision that it wouldn't be safe to bring Assange to the United States because our prison system is so brutal, and he was at risk for suicide. The U.S. government made assurances to the High Court in Britain, and they accepted those assurances. The underlying issues were not ruled in Assange's favor when they didn't want to extradite him because of the dangers to his health. And that's where he's being charged with, I think, 17 violations of the Espionage Act, which is a World War I relic, very repressive piece of legislation. And they've been using it against whistleblowers since Obama's time. It was hardly used from World War I when they went after people like Eugene Debs and A. Philip Randolph and Emma Goldman. And then it was used sparingly, very sparingly, until Obama. And now it's been a law that go after whistleblowers, which when you provide government information to the public, it doesn't mean you're espionage for a foreign agent. But that's what they've charged Assange with. And if he's convicted, it will mean all the investigative journalists for mainstream news outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal would be in jeopardy if they use information, publish information they get from leaked documents, which is what the news is every day. Most of what we learn about our government is from leaks. So this is a very important case, and it's bad news. I mean, Assange has already been basically locked up for 9 years since he had to go into the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid charges of rape and sexual molestation out of Sweden, which has since been dropped. And then the UK got him for jumping bail when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, and now the US is after him. So he's already spent nearly a decade in prison, and it's going to be years the way this thing is playing out. And he may be back here in the US dealing with this court case. So we need to keep our defense of Julian Assange up, because it's about not just his freedom as a journalist, but freedom of the press that all of us can use. And then, you know, the other bad news is ongoing bad news, this democracy crisis. And it's just inexplicable that the Democrats aren't really talking about it. They don't have any public campaign to get the, it's now called the Freedom to Vote Act, the shorter version of the watered down version of the For the People Act, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act. Meanwhile, the Republicans are out in the states gerrymandering districts so they can rule from a minority position, setting up rules so they can basically flip elections, steal elections. So this legislation would provide voting rights and election protection, and doesn't look like it's going anywhere. They keep talking about Build Back Better, but President Manchin is saying, let's wait till next year because of inflation. Which, you know, the filibuster is a democracy crisis in itself. It gives the minority a veto over what the majority wants. And what's sort of inexplicable and just infuriating is that Biden is still talking bipartisanship with a party that tried to overthrow his election. You know, the Democrats are bringing cupcakes to a knife fight. And, you know, I guess that's why we need the Green Party, because we're ready to fight the fascists, not try to go bipartisan with them, and push beyond just voting rights and election protection for fair ballot access, ranked choice voting for executive offices, including president, so that the spoiler effect is not in play, and people can vote for the Greens who they prefer rather than the Democrats as a lesser evil to stop Republicans, and for proportional representation against the exclusionary single-member district, winner-take-all system of elections in this country, which makes it very difficult for the Greens or anybody with an alternative point of view to get into the government in proportion to the support they have among the voters. And that, to me, is the game changer, and that's what we got to fight for. The Democrats aren't doing it. The Greens have got to take the lead on this fight for democracy. So, you know, the bad news is the Democrats are in a position to do something about it or not doing anything. So that's the good news and the bad news. Adam Kasuki. Why are some local and state Green parties anti-vaccine and anti-mask? Greater Milwaukee Green Party, for example. I think you're overstating. I think there is an anti-vaccine, anti-mask minority. I don't know. The people I know in Milwaukee are pro-mask, pro-vaccine. I know there's some people in the Wisconsin party that are anti-vaxxers, but you're asking why. And honestly, I think there are a lot of suckers on the progressive side who are being manipulated by a very well-funded campaign by far-right funders, from the Koch brothers, right-wing rich people in Australia, to this Chinese billionaire who is an expatriate, who is funding a lot of this anti-vaccine misinformation and disinformation, while he's also the sugar daddy for Steve Bannon. And I think the objective of the right is to use libertarian arguments to get illiberal results. So their business interests aren't regulated and they don't have to answer to any kind of democracy. And what's unfortunate is I think they're conspiracy-minded people who consider themselves progressives who fall for this. They can't tell the difference between, Big Pharma did manufacture or develop the vaccines with a lot of public money, but the safety of the vaccines is coming from scientific studies, reports from the field that are amassed in statistical studies and show the vaccine is effective in reducing harm from the virus. And then you end up with people saying, well, and there was a headline briefly back last spring where it said the vaccinated could spread the virus as much as the unvaccinated. Came from somebody in the CDC, and that was very quickly changed. But I seen, for example, Jimmy Dore put a headline up from CNN when the report first came out. And I looked that up and I found out that CNN changed the headline very quickly, but he published 6 months later a headline that was 6 months old and wrong. So I think a lot of people are falling for this propaganda. And so that's why I think there are anti-vaxxers and anti-mask people. And, the idea that public health measures, public safety measures, that you need to be vaccinated to be in a public place where you could spread the virus is like, we drive on the right side of the road and we agree to do that so we don't have head-on collisions. That's not a big impingement on your personal liberty. What is a danger is this anti-democracy movement we're getting from the far right, the Republican Party. And if people are concerned about their, civil liberties and democratic rights, that's what they should be fighting. Vaccine mandates, requiring people that work in hospitals and schools with coworkers or in public places like restaurants, requiring them to be vaccinated is, public health common sense. And, people are saying this is, the next, Nazi regime. I think that's just crazy. And it's ironic that the Nazis are putting that out there. So I think that's why a lot of people who have a conspiracy-minded mentality or approach to things rather than, a power structure or a class analysis of our society, and are able to, just make the distinction between, big pharma and the science that says those vaccines are pretty effective. So I think that's why we got this anti-vax, but it's a minority, I'm pretty sure, in the Green Party. And I know of no local or state Green parties that have taken a formal position against vaccines. And if the Greater Milwaukee Green Party did, I'd be surprised. Scout Trooper164, what do you think of Chris Cuomo suing CNN for firing him? I think Chris Cuomo is almost as bad as his brother Andrew, who I ran against 3 times. I haven't looked into the details of the lawsuit, but when he's a journalist and they're doing background information and actually trying to dig up dirt on the accusers of Andrew Cuomo of sexual assault is, beyond the pale. So good riddance, Chris Cuomo. David Schwab, correction. Speaking as co-chair of the Wisconsin Green Party, the Greater Milwaukee Green Party is neither anti-vaccine nor anti-mask. There may be a minority with those views, but not the party. Thank you, David. That was my suspicion, knowing a number of members of the Milwaukee Party. And thank you for letting us know, what the real deal is. Amy L. Sachs. Speaking of social media, I emailed the National Green Party to express support for the recent COVID statement. If you support it, consider doing the same. It's a bit tricky, but you can go through Green Party main page. I think a lot of the purported Twitter leftists had a rage fit about the statement, yelling about Nazism and so on. Ugly even for Twitter. Yeah, I've seen some of that because the COVID program that Angela and I put out during the campaign was linked in the news release that everybody's upset. Not everybody. A minority of anti-vaxxers are upset about. And they are very vocal. And I think most people in the Green Party, who support vaccinations and public health measures, they just go about their business. So, speaking up now it'd be a good time to do so in favor of that statement, which was, basically saying, we support vaccinations and COVID vaccine mandates where appropriate. David Schwab, what are your thoughts on the recent Teamsters Union election? Well, the reform slate won, and I'm happy about that. One of the second person in the slate, Zuckerman out of, I think it's Lexington, Kentucky. Anyway, he headed up the reform slate 4 years ago, and we came very close to getting the Hoffa regime out. This time, the reform slate beat the slate that Hoffa was retiring, Jimmy Hoffa Jr., but his people lost. And I think that's good. I think the Teamsters will be a little bit more open. They have to be accountable to this reform movement. They're going to be more militant, I think, in terms of particularly dealing with UPS and the new contract next year. UPS Teamsters were coasting on the very good contract they got as a result of the 1997 strike. And, I was in the Teamsters since then, and we never threatened to strike. And we accepted a lot of concessions, the worst being the last contract, where it set up a two-tier system for package drivers. So the new people hired had to work in the warehouse and then go out and deliver packages and either later in the same shift or in separate shifts, and at a lower rate of pay than the existing drivers. And that, of course, is a company strategy to divide the workers against each other, because the new workers resent the higher workers or the older workers' higher pay. And it just creates problems within the union. So a big issue is getting that two-tier system removed. And so that's coming up next year. And I think the leadership we got now will consider the strike option. And a strike by UPS workers is powerful because it's a major component of logistics and shipping in this country. So that's why that strike in 1997 only took 2 weeks for the company to say uncle. And I think, we're in a similar position now. It's strategic. As a retired Teamster, I couldn't vote. I did do a little campaigning on behalf of the reform slate. My local, my shop, or barn, as we call it in the Teamsters, voted overwhelmingly for the reform slate. So I didn't really need to do that much campaigning. So I think the Teamsters are in a better place, but there's still issues. I mean, the Teamsters as a whole are not good on the climate question. They tend to support fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, and things like that. The leadership has. That was not an issue in the campaign, but I don't know if the leadership is ready to, come out against these fossil fuel infrastructure projects like some of the service unions are. And being a retired Teamster, I don't have a vote anymore, so I can just, state my views. I can tell you that rank and file, and I found this among construction worker unions, and I used to be a construction worker as well. The grassroots rank and file workers are much more concerned about climate change and open to renewable energy jobs than the leadership tends to be, who tends to be conservative, and they just want to, keep the jobs they got rather than take the risk of having to organize new sectors, in like the renewable energy sector. So that's an issue going forward. And there's one piece of news that's good news. This probably came out the week before last. Some kind of business consulting firm did a survey of workers in the fossil fuel industry, asking them if they wanted to take jobs in the renewable sector. And a majority said they would like to take jobs, get out of fossil fuels and into renewables. So that's good. I mean, that just reinforces what I'm saying is the rank and file workers are often ahead of the labor bureaucrats on a lot of these issues. Howie, what are your thoughts on Afghans starving due to Biden's sanctions? Yeah, I mean, the sanctions should be lifted. We should be aiming to provide humanitarian aid, food relief, and just the conditions are, our aid workers are able to get it to the people that need it. And the Taliban is in a position where they need that desperately, because if people are starving and they're not delivering any kind of services, the people can be upset with them, and they will have a hard time maintaining power. So, just to impose the sanctions because you're mad that the Taliban basically beat our military, and there are good reasons for that. We were no better when it came to civilian deaths and not understanding the local situation than the terrorists who did suicide bombings and so forth were. So, that war was more fought to keep the money flow going to military contractors than with any real program of, building up civil society, not just in the cities, but in the rural areas, so that people could govern themselves. And so you get reports like Anand Gopal, who is a courageous journalist. He went back just as this was happening in the summer and went back into Taliban areas. He did that over a decade ago and wrote a book whose title I'm forgetting, but basically showed the U.S. was clueless and was being played by these local warlords and Taliban groups because they were using U.S. aid and statements about who was on which side to get back. It was about local disputes, and the U.S. was being played. So Anand went back and found out that people that don't like the Taliban in these rural areas, they're generally conservative Muslim people, but they don't like the Taliban, but they're glad the U.S. is out of there because of drone strikes and other aerial bombing, and then these special operations, missions that went right into people's homes and snatched and killed people they thought to be terrorists, which just alienated the whole rural sector of Afghanistan. So, the U.S. owes Afghanistan for all the destruction. It's not just 20 years. It goes back to when Brzezinski convinced Carter that we should start supporting the Islamic fundamentalists against the Afghan regime, which was nominally communist and secular and probably pushing too hard in the rural areas for modernization, which got the fundamentalists riled up, and the U.S. started through the CIA supporting them. This is even before the Soviets intervened to try to prop up that government, and so we continued supporting these Islamic groups that then later in the 20-year war, the forever war, we were fighting. Although in actuality, we were supporting some to fight against others. It was not a situation where our military could have a positive impact. So those are some of my thoughts. And, the basic thing is, the sanctions should be lifted. We should be providing aid and making friends instead of enemies by being the world's humanitarian superpower instead of its military global empire. And that should be a policy pretty much everywhere around the globe. Julle Baumert, what do you think about Biden's ratings being so low? Seems like his ratings keep getting lower and lower. Yeah, they do. I saw that he joked on Jimmy Kimmel, maybe it was last night, that Kimmel asked him, what does he think about his ratings? And Biden said, I stopped looking at them. They used to be in the 60s, but now that they're in the 40s, I stopped looking at them, which, I think humorous, good joke. But I think the reason Biden is not connecting is he's not out there with a clear message to people that are having economic troubles. And with inflation, and inflation in particular, people are not so sure about the economy. COVID is still an issue. The Afghan fiasco, the messy withdrawal is another problem. So he's got, real issues. And it's always hard to keep your ratings up once you become responsible for governing. But the other thing is, I mean, who's his competition? The Republicans really don't appeal positively to people for their programs. I mean, what they're doing, and they've mobilized a strong minority, they're scapegoating immigrants, racial minorities, women, quote unquote, uppity women, for problems that are really rooted in, corporations and the very rich getting richer and richer, and at the expense of the rest of us. And Biden, that is what he should be talking about. Instead, he's talking about how he can I can do bipartisanship. He gets an infrastructure bill passed that, for example, is terrible on climate. He appoints Jerome Powell, Trump's appointee for the Fed, to continue as the Fed chair, and said, "See, that's bipartisanship." I don't think people care that much about bipartisanship. They want to see real results. And Biden doesn't have a narrative to counter the Republican scapegoating narrative. He's saying we're going to do bipartisanship with those people, which in a way reinforces the Republican narrative. So, the Democrats' messaging is terrible. When you think of the Republicans, you know what they're against. Immigrants, they want to build a wall. Minorities, they need to get back down in their place from the viewpoint of the white supremacists. Women, same thing. And that's that's the Republican narrative. People get it. It appeals not to the majority, but to a strong minority. And then what's the Democratic narrative? What do the Democrats want to do? And they are getting defined by others. They're socialists. They are too woke, making you take cultural positions you don't want to take. Stuff like that, where they need a narrative that says, we're looking out for the regular people and we're going to deliver results. And Build Back Better has programs in it that could do that, although they've been watered down so much and distorted by privatization and means testing that they're not going to be that effective. But anyway, the basic answer is the Democrats' narrative is not reaching people in a way that they can say, yeah, that's what the Democrats are for, and I'm for that too. They're just not making that communication. The Republicans are killing them on the messaging. Aaron K. Revelis, I hope I pronounced your name right. Howie, what do you think about the left unity slate in California between the Green Party and the Peace and Freedom Party? I can't comment in detail about the different candidates. I like the basic concept. I like the fact that Green Party and Peace and Freedom are trying to cooperate. I know there's some disputed positions. There's some question within the Green Party about the process, and I'm not close enough to it to take a position on that. But I like the basic approach, particularly in a single-member district winner-take-all system, and in California where you got the top two coming out of a jungle primary. The more the left can get together behind a common slate, the better, and the more likely some of them will get to the general election past the jungle primary. So in principle, I like it. In the details, I know there's some controversies, and I'm not close enough to them to say much more about them. Scout Trooper164 Howie, what are your thoughts on Donald Trump's not endorsing candidates who didn't help with his big lie and is taking advantage of a strategy that Dems don't use? I'm trying to think what you're referring to in that last part. Donald Trump, you can say a lot of things about him negative, and I can do that all day, but the fact that he sticks to his guns and works with people that agree with him gives him power. And the big lie is a big lie, but I guess what you're referring to, why don't the Democrats, hold their people to account? And I think the problem there is the Democrats are really more than one party. You got the progressives and you got the corporate Democrats, who are the bigger, more powerful faction of the Democratic Party. So it's hard for them to take a position and hold people to it, although the DNC and the top leadership has tried to discourage progressives from running primaries giving them access to party resources and so forth. So the Democrats do it a little bit, but it's not public like Trump, which builds support in the public. It's kind of, behind the scenes in the inside game. But I think that explains why the Democrats can't do like Trump is. The other thing Trump's got for him is the Republican Party has become his cult followers. I mean, they had a convention. They didn't adopt a platform. They said, we'll do whatever Donald Trump says. That's pathetic. But it does give Trump power because he's got the whole party afraid of him. And it's a threat to all of us, what they're doing. Because when, a third of the country thinks the last election was fraudulent, the legitimacy of the government and the idea that we can talk our differences through and have a legislative process where you win some and you lose some. Now it's like we win or we fight. And you got to realize the far right is armed and some of those people want to use them. So we're in a dangerous situation. Bob Rasch, Howie, what do you think about the Biden administration's hawkish response to the current escalating tensions and conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Yeah, I think the saber rattling is not what's needed. What Putin asked for basically is that the U.S. and NATO say we're not going to bring Ukraine into the NATO alliance. And even though that will take years of process to do, NATO and the U.S. should say that. I mean, we know, and it's well documented now, that when the U.S. and Russia, George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev negotiated allowing Germany to reunite, the U.S. promised that NATO would not expand beyond Germany. And then Clinton got in there and pushed it right up into Russia's face. And, from just a geopolitical viewpoint, and not saying anything about Russia's politics, you can understand why the Russians are afraid, because they're surrounded. And then you got historically Ukraine, the Russian, center of the development of the Russian ethnic group and eventually the Russian Empire is from Kiev, which is in Ukraine. So there's a lot of entanglements there. And for, the U.S. to not respond to, Putin's demands positively, or at least say, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's agree on basically spheres of influence. That is something that Biden, I would have liked to have seen him do that. And there are a number of, foreign policy analysts. Melvin Goodman had a good article on this in Counterpunch last week that I tweeted about. So the saber rattling is not helping. We need to come to terms with Russia so we can deal with issues like climate change, the new nuclear arms race, and the global economy. And instead, we're threatening to basically isolate Russia. We're not going in militarily. Biden made that clear, which thank God, because we don't want a nuclear war. But the economic sanctions that he's putting out there on the table, that Biden is, are crippling for Russia and will push them into the economic, banking, and monetary arena of China. So I think that, the saber rattling is negative, and if we, could come to terms on, and then Ukraine, according to the Minsk agreement, would be neutral, and the Russian ethnic groups in the West would have some autonomy, and it'd be more of a federal system in the Ukraine. That was all agreed to, but Ukraine, and with NATO and the U.S. backing them, has not, fulfilled their end of the Minsk agreements. The other side has not been completely adherent to them, but that's what we should get back to. And that was negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. wasn't involved. So, we should support that kind of regional agreement. So that's what I think. Thoughts on Bob Dole? Well, he was a Republican when the Republicans were a conservative party, and he was pretty difficult to deal with, very conservative. Wouldn't agree with him on many things, but he wasn't crazy like the Republican Party is now. Now, I was wondering when he died, what kind of state of mind he is, because I haven't heard him speak out, for example, against the big lie. He may have been too old and out of it to be able to do that. It would have been, nice if some old Republicans like him would do that. But, he was a very conservative guy and fortunately not a good campaigner or, because he was twice the Democratic or Republican nominee for president. So, that's what I think about Bob Dole. I haven't thought much about him, frankly. Julle Baumert, how do you feel about people that have chosen to get the vaccine or being asked to take numerous boosters? I've noticed now they're saying a certain age in children are also having to get the booster. Well, the booster increases, your antibodies and your immune response. And I think if that's, where we're at with the vaccines, I think that's good. Get the booster. I got mine. In fact, they're talking about we may need to boost, frequently like we do with flu vaccines because the immune response wanes after a while and because the vaccine or the virus keeps mutating. But that's nothing new. I mean, we do that with flu vaccinations. There are other vaccines that have to be boosted after a certain period. So that's not that surprising. As far as children getting the booster, if the medical community finds that it's safe and effective, then that's good, and we should boost the children. Hey, Eric Gray asks, hey, Howie, what are your thoughts on the Virginia government attacking critical race theory in an attempt to ban discussion of things like socialism, Marxism, and communism? I think they don't want to discuss the history of this country that includes the viewpoints of people that were oppressed by the dominant system, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinos. And that's what that's really about. They call it socialism, Marxism, communism to smear it. But it's really about, the question of our racial history. And that's what they want to really ban the discussion about. Because, the people that want to maintain white supremacist power don't want people having a critical understanding of how racism developed in this country and has continued. And that's what they don't want discussion of. And of course, they're not teaching critical race theory like it was developed in the law schools in any of our public schools. But what they're really doing is not going after critical race theory. They're going after Black history and actually women's history, gay history, and even talking about those things. And that's, so it's, these right wingers talk about cancel culture and pose as victims, but here they are, banning discussions. I mean, that's cancel culture if there ever was any. Mr. Anderson, is there any actual hope of waiving vaccine patents? It's been all talk for too long. Yeah, I agree. I've actually been talking with some Greens about maybe doing a statement on that. We're kind of waiting to see what the National Party would do. I did talk to one of the authors, asking them if they were going to cover that, just to see if I should write something, either give to them or put out, through my campaign. And they did put in a word about that. I mean, the situation now is what needs to happen is the World Trade Organization has to lift the intellectual property rights. They call it TRIP. I forget what that acronym stands for. But for these vaccines so that they can be produced and distributed at cost in the poor countries of the world, which are grossly under-vaccinated and just haven't had access to it because keeping the patents on the vaccines makes them too expensive. And so India and South Africa proposed this in October 2020 to an upcoming, it was after the June 2020 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO that was supposed to be in Kazakhstan in June 2020. And it was canceled because of the COVID virus. It took them 18 months to reschedule. And it was scheduled for the first week of December. And it canceled again because of Omicron. So this proposal from South Africa and India couldn't be considered. And the U.S. position, as Biden has twice publicly said, he's for a patent waiver. He said it in the spring of 2021, in the spring of 2021, and again, right before this 12 ministerial meeting of the WTO was supposed to happen. But the reporting shows that in the preparatory meetings and the technical meetings of the WTO, the U.S. negotiators are not taking that position. They are protecting Big Pharma and their patents, as have G8 countries like the UK and Germany. So, yeah, there's hope. We got to push the WTO not to wait 18 months more for the meeting where they can actually make this change. I mean, they can all get on Zoom and do it soon. And it's really important so that the vaccine can be distributed around the world, or the vaccines, I should say. And the hope, I mean, all we can do is speak out and demand. You know, the World Health Organization, many countries are supportive of this. Biden's on a record for it, even if behind the scenes his people are not following through. I mean, I think it's an issue in contention. It's something we got to speak up about. And it has been talked too long. I completely agree with that. I mean, it's just inconceivable. What's the word? You know, inexcusable that 2 years into this pandemic, and we still don't have the vaccine patents waived and the vaccine being produced and distributed everywhere in the world. Underhaven, hey Howie, how do you feel about NFTs? I'm told they're bad for the environment. Okay, NFTs. Somebody asked me about this 2 weeks ago, and people have sent me information, and I haven't had time to read it up. But okay, thank you. Non-fungible tokens, which I think means, if I understand correctly, you can buy pieces of investments in things like, you know, rare art. That it's an investment and it can increase in value. And I don't know what non-fungible token means exactly. I got to still do the research on this. But so the question is, what do I think about it? I think I need to do some more studying on it so I understand it better. Jason Sean, Richard Wright. I agree with the point that we need to help the world, those countries which produce the vaccine, and I also see the need for mass at-home tests to be distributed across the entire nation immediately. Why, in the Greens' opinion, is the current administration not on board with this plan to attack against COVID? Yeah, I saw a little snippet of a news conference where Jen Psaki was asked, you know, why don't we just distribute the at-home mass tests? And she said, basically, well, it'd be expensive. Who's going to pay for it? You know, it's like, what are lives worth? I mean, the point is to protect lives. And we spend so much on destroying lives with a bloated military budget that is, the Congress made $24 billion more than the Pentagon asked for. I mean, you want to know where the money is? It's in the military budget. And yes, getting the at-home tests distributed would be a good public health measure. And it's something the federal government is in a position to do. And they got the money if they get their priorities straight. Lawrence Seeger, have you heard about the new hemp compound that is 8 times stronger than lithium batteries, made from hemp waste? World-changing tech. Yes, I've heard about it. I've read articles about it, which I've forwarded to others. And as I understand it, they've had good, experimental and what do you call it when you do prototypes? That the issue is using that for conducting current within batteries, I believe, rather than with lithium. And, it's definitely something we should pursue because growing hemp, and it's the hemp fibers that, they can be used in hemp paper and hemp clothes, but it's the fiber in the stems, as I recall, the stem of the bush that have this property. And of course, it's a lot more environmentally benign to grow hemp and process it than to dig up lithium or even recycle it from used up batteries. So I think that's a technology that an eco-socialist Green New Deal would certainly put the R&D money in the budget toward. Scout Trooper 164, what are your thoughts about the media lying about aspects such as inflation while we endure food shortages? I don't know if to me is lying so much about inflation as inflating inflation. It's pretty clear, I think, that a lot of inflation is due to supply chain and basic supply issues coming out of the COVID lockdown. Production was down. People have cash from some of the payments that were made, and they're buying more goods. They still can't spend on services like entertainment and travel and eating at restaurants and that kind of thing. So that's why you've got this high demand for physical goods, which has created the supply chain issue, which then more demand than supply means prices go up. I think that's the underlying cause of most of the inflation. Now, the food shortages, I guess you're referring to, not everything being fully in stock in grocery stores because, certain products are in short supply. And again, I think that's, an issue of coming out of the COVID lockdown when people have a lot of cash. So I think the inflation, that basic underlying cause is going to work itself out. And it's not a long-term problem because the conditions we had before the COVID lockdown remain the same. Global economy with high competition. And so producers are competing on price. And that, brings the price down. Scout Trooper 164, what are your thoughts on cars being developed to be recharged instead of needing gasoline? Do you think this will help the environment due to having fewer cars requiring gas or a new problem? Well, yeah, if the electricity they're recharging with is from renewable sources, instead of burning gasoline car per car, you're going to have less emissions, less impact on the climate. That's all to the good. What I'm concerned about is that, and this is in Biden's infrastructure and Build Back Better bills, there's an emphasis on basically replacing vehicle for vehicle combustion engines with internal combustion engines with electric engines. And then you still have the problem of resources. Lithium was mentioned. Cobalt is another. Those are rare metals, require mining, big environmental impact. So we would be better off moving transportation more onto rails for both freight and passenger travel and having fewer individual vehicles, electric trucks to bring, products the last mile to the store or the home. And then vehicles for, more special uses, rather than everybody having a personal vehicle. Public transit should be cheap, even free, and convenient, more convenient and faster than getting in the car and getting in traffic jams. So that's, I think, the direction we need to go. So if we just, build a massive electric car industry in place of the massive internal combustion car industry, we're going to still have a lot of environmental problems with respect to, issues like lithium and cobalt and just, the steels and plastics that they use to manufacture cars. We want to reduce our resource use as well as our power use and emissions of carbon. So, the basic point is replace the vehicles we need with electric vehicles, but replace the need for so many vehicles with, freight rails and passenger rails. Julle Baumert Are there talks about a Green Party running for president next election? And will it be you? Man, I get asked that. I just got asked that on the last phone call I was on. I'm not even looking at that till we get through the midterms. I'm in New York. We have the hardest ballot access petition in the world that I can find. We need to get 45,000 signatures in 42 days in the spring, April and May. And then we got to get nearly 200,000 votes to keep the ballot line. So that's what I'm looking at. And if we can get that ballot line back in New York, that's going to make whoever runs for president for the Green Party next time, it's going to make it a lot easier for them to focus on the many other states where we need to get ballot access. Because this petition is, about a $150,000 petition to pay the petitioners to get it done in the fast time frame and the high amounts. You say 45,000 signatures, you really need 90,000 to be safe. So that's just a gargantuan job. So the only talks I've heard is, am I running? And my answer is, I'll look at that after the midterm elections. Mr. Anderson, Howie thoughts on superblocks, like what is going on in Catalonia, Spain. I'm not sure what you mean by superblocks. He may mean where they consolidate a bunch of blocks and then take the cars and the auto traffic out of the internal streets. And yeah, that would free up a lot of land for park. You'd still need some paths so people who need or disabled can, okay, they say that's what a super block is. You're gonna still need some paths so people that need to get around electric vehicles, golf carts or whatever, because they're handicapped, and to deliver things to where people are living and shopping. But you can greatly reduce the amount of street traffic and parking space you need, which takes up so much of our urban land space. So that's an more efficient use of urban land. And that's the direction we got to move on for climate and environmental reasons. And I haven't seen what's going on in Catalonia, so I'm going to have to look that up as well as NFTs. Scout Trooper164 Howie, what do you think the Federal Reserve, which was established at least a century ago, or do I think the Federal Reserve, which was established at least a century ago, is a major problem for income and money these days? Well, I think our central bank should be democratically accountable. Right now, it's nominally independent. So the Fed chair is appointed by president. I think some of the other board members are appointed by the president, but they're also elected by private banks. So it's more oriented to serving the big banking industry than the public. And of course, the Green Party has a plank where we would bring the monetary authority of the Federal Reserve into the Treasury Department, and it would issue greenbacks rather than Federal Reserve notes, which would be debt-free money, excuse me, that could then be spent into the economy in accordance with the federal budget. So we wouldn't have to do so much borrowing to cover our expenses as a government. So that's where I would like to see our central bank go. Should be part of the administration, democratically accountable, and able to produce this debt-free money when we need to make expenses. That's not to say we shouldn't be taxing to bring in income for the government, but that's a wash for the economy because you're taking money out of the economy when you do taxes. That's why this Build Back Better nonsense from Manchin about it being inflationary. Not if the expenses proposed in Build Back Better are covered by taxation. And then you're not adding to the money supply. You're spending money and then getting it back in taxes. To be technical, you may put money in before those taxes come in and expand the monetary supply for a relatively short time. But in the long run, it's a wash. So Manchin is kind of full of it in that regard. But these issues should be not esoteric, but part of what we talk about when we talk about public policy, because the federal government, through the Treasury Department Monetary Authority, would be making those decisions, as opposed to a nominally independent Federal Reserve that is, where the big banks have a lot of influence in terms of what policies they adopt. And, if we'd have had that back when we were coming out of the real inflation in the late 70s, early 80s, and instead of Volcker, shock doctrine, very high interest rates, which crashed the economy, and then the Fed, which is supposed to balance the need for price stability and jobs, emphasized price stability, and we've had structurally high unemployment throughout that period. That would have been a matter of public debate, and the people could have debated, what the monetary policy should have been. So I'm for democratizing our central bank. Jeffrey Denton, happy birthday, Howie. Thank you. You're a few days late, but I appreciate it. Thank you for the birthday wishes, everybody. So, oh boy, now everybody's wishing me happy birthday. That's not the purpose of this live stream. So I appreciate the birthday wishes. Veronica Fimbris, do you think the Green Party should endorse peace and freedom or Democrats over their own Green Party candidates that are running? I just want to know what you think or feel about this. Well, I think we should not cross-endorse Democrats. It's, a capitalist party. It's a corporate party. And the progressives in there, if they really are democratic socialists, should get out, because they're the tail on the Democratic donkey. They basically make it look better than it is. And peace and freedom, which is independent of the corporate power structure, I think we can cross-endorse them. But where we have Greens and peace and freedom running together, this is California. We should ask ourselves, why is that? Why can't we? Because there are plenty of offices to run for, and we're not filling the ballots up with either party. Why can't we cooperate on, which party runs for which office, or at least hope to do that? And that's where I would move toward if, I was in California. And when we ran for president, Angela and I sought the peace and freedom nomination. Didn't get it, but I think to build a broad independent left that can take on the two capitalist parties, we need to work together with everybody we can work together with. The Memdroid. Is it true that a strong welfare state slows innovation? If not, why do so many conservatives and libertarians say so? Yeah, they think that people are lazy, and the only way they'll get off their butts and do something is if they're faced with the threat of starvation. Whereas the reality is the people that get welfare state benefits, like public housing or Medicaid, so they can, be healthy and get over illnesses, that gives people a foundation on which they can do innovation. If you're in a struggle just for survival, how are you going to innovate? So, and then they're hypocritical, particularly the conservatives, not the libertarians so much, because we have a corporate welfare state. And there are all kinds of subsidies for big business and tax breaks. And they say, we won't do it unless you give us these breaks and these subsidies. So they're the ones that, are saying that corporate welfare speeds innovation, which is not really true. You look at big pharma, they tend to emphasize development of drugs that are profitable, the drugs you need every day, like what? Viagra, rather than vaccines, which, just need to be taken once or infrequently. And, we got a real problem in that we have drug-resistant bacteria and viruses that are developing. And all the research on that is being done by the public. And then we get situations like we did with the COVID vaccines, where the government put a lot of money in to help these companies do the research and develop them on a fast timeline. So that actually sped up the innovation, those public subsidies. So, then to ask, why do the conservatives and libertarians say so? Because they don't want to pay the taxes for it. That's all it is. They don't want to pay taxes for anything. So they're against any expenditures except those that subsidize them. And then they're willing to tax us, the regular folks, for that. And we're now in a situation since the Trump tax cuts where you have together state, local, and federal taxes, and working people are paying the same rate overall in taxes as the super rich. So there is no progressivity left in the U.S. tax system. And anyway, they don't want to pay taxes. I think that's the real story behind their opposition to the welfare state. They just don't want to pay for it. And it's 4 o'clock, so that's the end of the hour. I thank everybody for wishing me a happy birthday and for your questions. And I hope people are feeling how much I do, or as much as I do, this democracy crisis. I mean, we're in a situation where the Republicans are getting control of the election machinery. There's reporting this week on how the Republicans in Georgia, who got control of the state election board, are now basically purging county election boards, not just of Democrats, but of Black Democrats. I mean, this is old Jim Crow garbage. And that kind of thing is going on in, various ways in about 30 states where the Republicans have control of the state legislatures. And as I said at the top, it's kind of inexplicable why the Democrats aren't fighting, why the voting rights and election protection legislation doesn't pass in the Congress, why they're letting Manchin be president and veto everything, and not having a big public fight about it. I mean, I think most of the people want, a democracy and fair elections. It's not a matter of convincing the majority. It's a matter of stopping this minority from seizing power in undemocratic ways and then stifling democracy and ruling as a minority. That's where we're headed. And that, of course, if it's the it will be the Republicans if they do that. And then the issues that we're concerned about, climate, equality, peace, are going to have a hell of a time, getting any advantage. Sometimes with the Democrats, we can win reforms. I mean, the Green New Deal came from the Green Party, and some of the Democrats talk about it. I guess that's progress. Not with the Republicans. And that's where we're at. It's a real threat to democracy. And, if this legislation doesn't pass, the gerrymandering will be done, and the die will be cast for the 2022 elections to the House. The Republicans will take it back, and, we're in a world of trouble. So, for Greens, that means we got to double down on the democracy fights we're doing for ourselves, ballot access, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. And we got to pick up the torch that the Democrats have dropped with respect to voting rights and election protection. And so, we'll be in the 2022 elections, and you're going to hear the Democrats and, the progressive intelligentsia that's not too intelligent these days saying the Greens should drop out and rely on the Democrats. Well, they had the chance this year, and they haven't done it. And they're letting the Republicans, like I said, they're coming to a knife fight with cupcakes. And they're getting sliced up. So we got to step up and fight for our democracy. So that's my message for the week. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week.